Listeners, do you like room temperature ale?
Do you like making risque jokes to a new interlocutor before wondering whether they are in fact from Hope Not Hate and have a wire underneath their shirt?
Then you will love the Anglo-Futurist drinks taking place on the 14th of November. We will be hosting another one of our drinks that was very popular last time, at least to the people who turned up. And we don't know what happens about the people who didn't turn up.
Many people turn up and they assure us they had a wonderful time.
Exactly. This is an unknown, and we will disregard it for this matter.
And if you want to come, you should use the Calendar app, which is in our show notes. It's an Anglo-Futurist project.
So Tom and I, for example, live together. So when we might use this app, Calendar might say to us, gosh, you're
both in the living room.
You're both in the living room. Why don't you turn on the television? And we would go, bloody hell, I'd never thought of that. And it can do even more than just that. So we encourage you, sign up on the app, on the link, using the link in our show notes, and join us on the 14th for ale, conversation, and
mild paranoia about Hope Not Hate operatives. An evening with dangerous intellectuals.
An evening with dangerous pseudo-intellectuals.
Who now has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country?
Georgian townhouses on the moon.
The highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way.
Small modular reactors under every village green.
This is Anglo-Futurism.
Welcome back to the King Charles III Space Station. I'm Calum Drysdale.
I'm Tomo. Good to have you back.
Readers of the Times will know that on this podcast, we like to cast a rapacious eye towards the mineral riches of the British Antarctic Territory.
But British Antarctica is, of course, just one of Britain's 17 Crown dependencies and overseas territories, also known as the CDOTs.
And perhaps our rapacity can extend even further.
Today, we bring you the man who wants to devour the South Sandwiches, make Jersey sweat, and deflower the Virgin Islands.
Bermuda, I hardly know her.
James Kingston, CDOT Czar, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Great to have you, James. Today, we're going to chat about your CDOT paper, which was the Adam Smith Institute. Was it early this year?
Yes, came out in February.
Could you give us a brief summary?
We're slow readers.
Imagine that we haven't read the paper.
So this is a paper really designed to address some misconceptions, some views on the British Crown dependencies and overseas territories. So the jumping off point for this paper is a particular narrative that these jurisdictions represent a shadow empire for British finance, and that this shadow empire has a damaging effect on Britain and the wider world. So going into that paper, decided to look into the question of, firstly, well, is it a shadow empire for Britain? And secondly, insofar as it is or isn't, what actually are the positives and negatives of this relationship? Because if it is a shadow empire, if it does have benefit for Britain, you wouldn't want to get rid of it willy-nilly.
I mean, shadow empire to me sounds pretty good. And these, we should probably say, are the Crown dependencies and overseas territories. So things like
Falklands, Gibraltar,
the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands.
Indeed, yes.
Which I think
the British Antarctic Territory, which I do not believe is mentioned more than once in your paper.
I must hang my head in shame. You can't see it, but it is hanging.
Tragically under-financialized, I think, is what we
tragically
learn
under-financialized
about the British Antarctic Territory. But I think what's interesting about it is we hear these islands, the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and they come up in like John Grisham novels as the place where the lawyer goes and is seduced by a prostitute and thus is blackmailed and must engage in various illegal activities. I've read one John Grisham novel, but I think a lot of people don't realise that these are actually British, and like all the activity that goes on, because it is an astonishing amount of activity, is like ultimately, well, maybe at an arm's length, like linked to Britain and under our control.
Absolutely. So what the paper really looks at is, and indeed it is a quite financially concerned paper, so sadly the Penguins didn't get too much of a look in, although we can just come back to that, as I do have some interesting thoughts, I think. What the paper looks at is that relationship, the fact that there is a vast amount of capital every year, every day, every week, flooding in and out of these islands and in and out of the UK, and the benefits and the impacts that this has back home in the UK. Each of these jurisdictions, the financially focused ones, that is, has some kind of specialism, particularly in finance, but in other areas too. So it's really diving into that and thinking through what does it do now and what can we make it do in future, and how can we help this relationship benefit Britain even more.
And we're curious about the genesis of this paper, because you're not a kind of professional CDOT botherer, are you? I mean, how can we describe what you do, and how can we describe where the paper arose from?
Well, I think anyone who knows me suspects I'm probably an amateur CDOT botherer, if anything.
I am, as are all three of us.
Yeah, in fact, yes. So I'm originally from the Isle of Man, so I've always had something of a personal interest in this weird and wonderful set of jurisdictions distributed around the world, of which my homeland is one. My background, other than being from the Isle of Man, is that my business, Dow SPV, focuses on setting up international corporate structures for the blockchain industry. So that gives me a certain professional interest in the world of these jurisdictions. A vested interest, I should say.
Exactly. This is forming a key pillar of a PR strategy.
Yes. And on the other side, I'm just an enormous history nerd. I've been thinking about these jurisdictions for years, reading about the criticisms that have been mounted against them, struggled often with the criticisms, and so decided a year ago now, over a year ago, to really dive in and see if these criticisms made any sense. And thus was birthed the paper.
Right, so for some of us, the radicalizing moment was the giveaway of the Chagos Islands, and that's when I got into Antarctica. But for you, it must have been old hat, this idea that we weren't making the most of our overseas territories.
I think we should also probably ask as well, what are they? Because the Isle of Man, I think people vaguely have heard of, but they don't really understand. Is it part of Britain? What is the relationship?
And what's the difference between a Crown dependency and an overseas territory?
Yeah.
I think that's a really good question. So these are a set of multiple different jurisdictions who are a kind of, you might say, an arm's length relationship to the British Crown. So ultimate sovereignty is vested in the Crown and in Britain. But each of these islands has a separate relationship. So, for instance, in the case of Jersey and Guernsey, these were originally part of the Duchy of Normandy, the feudal patrimony of the English Crown. The Isle of Man is another jurisdiction. It sort of went back and forth between England and Scotland for multiple years, ended up being the personal property of various lordly families, and is now a Crown dependency, just like Jersey and Guernsey, although for a separate history. And then the other jurisdictions, each of whom has its own unique history and slightly different level of powers potentially had by Westminster, are really remnants, residues, inherited parts of the former British imperial network.
So the tide went out of the empire, and everywhere that had been populated eventually became independent. But what seems to me to be the common factor between the overseas territories is that they never had any meaningful population, and so there was no one to ashamedly hand them back to.
I think, honestly, it really varied. So firstly, it really, as people point out quite strongly in Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man, these were never part of the British Empire per se. They preceded empire. So they are not, in that sense, imperial possessions.
They're Crown dependencies, right? Rather than the overseas territories.
Yes. As for the overseas territories, it's a bit of a mix. So something like Ascension Island, yes, there was no one there to hand it over to, and also it's quite a useful base. The Falkland Islands, well, that, as I think the readers of this podcast
there
will be
was
fairly
nobody there.
Yes. Has a bit of a history there. And then as for the other islands, Varies. Often they just simply didn't want to go independent. There's quite an interesting episode called The Bay of Piglets, for
Chagos
instance.
Islands. Yes, sorry, go on.
Where Anguilla was the British administrators were trying to make Anguilla become independent, but they didn't want to be, thus developing a rather farcical episode where the British government invaded it to try and stop it from not wanting to be independent, but it's
why is the thing that often like frustrates me and bemuses me, and maybe it was this attitude that like because Malta voted to remain or to join Britain or to remain part like under British control, and we just ignored it.
We said no, right?
Malta's a really interesting one. I go down to Malta quite a lot. I think a lot of it is really vested in firstly, naturally, the political dynamics of Malta, the split between the nationalists and the Labour Party there, but it's also the personalities. So Dom Mintoff was the leader of the Labour Party. Interestingly, the Labour Party, the Socialist Party, were the most pro-British group, which is sort of runs a little bit counterintuitive to conventional prejudices, perhaps, or prejudice expectations. They very nearly became part, of Britain proper. But in the end, it came down to a budget argument. The British civil servants are very worried that Malta, which at that point the economy was cratering, would be an enormous drain on finances, and the Maltese, for their part, didn't think the British were willing to offer them enough. So, honestly, I think it could have gone a different way.
We are sort of, and what the Germans will go to. Which is the island in the Mediterranean that the Germans will go to? And we go to Magaluf or Zante. That we could have had our own outpost for to send our expeditionary summer hordes.
Yeah, and we could have merged with France as well.
Yes,
in a similar period of history.
Yes, one of Churchill's zania proposals.
But weren't the French sort of keen on it themselves? I remember like De Gaulle.
I thought it was a French proposal.
Yeah, like
really?
De Gaulle was ultimately the one.
Twice.
Like De Gaulle was the one that kind of put the kibosh, but like there was like serious effort on both sides.
Interesting. I can't see it as working for very long.
I mean, again, what a glorious crown dependency that would have been.
But you say in your paper that, you quote this hoary old argument that CDOTs facilitate a range of phenomena, including tax evasion, money laundering, capital flights, both in the UK and wider world, and a wider over-reliance by the UK economy on financial services.
So you've made all the positive arguments. So maybe give us some of the negative ones.
Yes. So look, I think these are the kind of things that come up again and again when people talk about these jurisdictions. But I think as this, really diving into the paper, obsessing about it for the prolonged period that I did, most of them are out of date or just frankly wrong. The money laundering side, let's not insult anyone's intelligence. Definitely financial practices were a hell of a lot looser in the 1980s and 1990s. All kinds of stuff might have gone on. Well, did go on in certain cases, but that also happened everywhere. Now, it's actually very difficult to do that kind of thing. These jurisdictions have signed up to all kinds of international reporting standards, and the ones that are, large financial centres like Cayman, Jersey, Guernsey in particular, they would kill the golden goose if they were to be found engaging in all kinds of bad practices. It would crater their economy. So they have a vested interest in being whiter than white. This kind of dynamic comes up again and again. Sadly, it's just not as sexy and interesting a story to talk about how white these jurisdictions are.
Let's get really to what I think the thing that really shocked me is how big is this golden goose? Because I think whatever number listeners think that James is about to say, it will be larger. Like how much money is flowing through these jurisdictions?
Oh, vast amount. I mean, you're looking at hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars. I mean, it's huge.
Comparable to the British GDP then.
Absolutely.
About 3 trillion?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, obviously, that's, in a sense, nominal. These jurisdictions, they sit as intermediaries. There might be vast amounts of money being booked through the Cayman Islands or Jersey or Guernsey or the BVI or the Isle of Man, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily actually sitting there. But it is, nevertheless, completely fascinating. These are, if you're interested, it's almost... You can kind of see a lot of the evolution and developments of the last several decades of global capitalism told through these jurisdictions. They are a lens upon which to look at the entirety of globalization, I think. You can really geek out.
Can you give us a case study then of like an unusual legislative situation in one of these overseas territories that gives it a comparative advantage?
So I think there's probably quite a few. What a lot of it comes down to is the fact that these jurisdictions can move more quickly. They can be a lot more nimble. You know, if you consider some of these places that maybe have 50,000 residents, 100,000, a much smaller professional services community, well, large for the size, but, you know, smaller in general, fewer stakeholders compared to a large state of, say, 60 million people or 600 million people. So they can just grab opportunities and move. And also they have to grab opportunities because the way that a lot of these jurisdictions, British or otherwise, that are focused on international finance developed, you know, they're usually quite small, quite remote, don't have vast amount of natural resources, so they have to attract the business. So this happens quite a few times, but one of the interesting ones is the funds industry, for instance. So the Cayman Islands really led in the development of the international funds industry and is now the leading place for the setup of hedge funds internationally. Or Bermuda, you know, that's one of the main places for, in particular, reinsurance. The Cayman Islands, again, because it's a particularly innovative place, has really grabbed the Web3 world. So, you know, if you want to launch a DAO and you want to have it legally wrapped, you can now use particular entities in the Cayman Islands. So again and again, they have this history of innovation, grabbing new opportunities, and just being dynamic.
There was actually a listener to this show, in fact, one of our benefactors on Substack, who I believe to be currently in the British Virgin Islands as we speak. So we too have a vested interest in the financial success.
Yeah.
I won't say who.
And keeping him or her sweet.
Right.
I mean, it's not just. Come on, let's be frank about this. It's not just the very forward-looking legislative and regulatory environment. It's also the fact that often they don't charge very much. Right, by being smaller, you can afford to scrape a far smaller amount off a big number, and it be like still quite a lot of wealth. Like there is an advantage in them being. As you say, there's a huge amount of money flowing through, but it's flowing through because it won't be touched there. That I think, is a key thing to talk about. Right?
Yeah, so obviously, you're quite right. Alongside the maybe quite innovative corporate laws themselves, there is fundamentally the tax question. These jurisdictions, as they will tend to refer to it these days, are tax neutral, which largely means that they are, 0% tax or very low tax on a given set of things, corporate tax being one of the main ones. That attracts people in. The benefit that this offers is that, it all then connects back to the double tax treaties. Because, for instance, if you have a place that is 0% tax, is actually, as I emphasize, entirely visible because it's signed up to all of these information exchange treaties, and then doesn't actually have double taxation treaties in place. What that means is, there might be this top-line headline of, oh, look, this jurisdiction isn't making the companies there pay any tax. But the tax authorities of the home jurisdictions, the investors who put their money in, they can see that they own the entity in that particular jurisdiction. They can see it hasn't been taxed, and they can just tax it at home. So even on that, there's a positive case to be made, because what you're doing is pooling the capital in a neutral place, lowering the cost of capital, and then ultimately, home authorities can get more money out of it. And that's precisely what happens in Britain. The narrative that these jurisdictions are stealing money from the British state, that they are in some way a drag on the British economy, it's simply and unmeasurably untrue.
Well, I think the really interesting thing about your paper is the idea that we can get more out of these unrealized assets. And I want to give a tip of the hat at this stage to friend of the pod, Aris Rusinos, who wrote on this topic in January. And it's a good sentence, so I'm going to quote it. Britain is like a cash-poor, asset-rich, elderly woman who has somehow inherited a portfolio of scattered high-value properties she doesn't know what to do with. Do you agree with this reading of, there just being kind of money on the table?
I do. There's already some very positive things happening. What's strange is that these positives aren't talked about enough. And because there's that lack of talking about it, that ignorance, sadly a certain skepticism, it means we miss all kinds of ways to, accelerate the positives to make it even better. So like right now, these jurisdictions collectively represent Britain's 9th largest export market. And that's without any kind of attempt at, central coordination or sharing of resources or boosting it in strategic areas. Just think if we're being creative, just think of what we could do. So one of my favorite hobby horses is data laws, for instance. So a few years ago, I was working at a particular university spin-out, which created data as an asset class. And then, the whole idea was to erect a market infrastructure to enable people to transact in their data and get more value out of it. Now, imagine, if you think of these jurisdictions, what they are is a set of separate legal spaces with English-derived laws. They all have the common law. They're places that we can experiment and therefore boost all kinds of industries. Finance, yes, that's kind of already the strength, but we can do it in technology and other things too. So, why don't we experiment with data laws or experiment with new corporate structures to situate that data and actually then boost the amount of data inputs into the AI industry, as well as, other kind of more financial focused things could come on that. And the good thing is that's actually exactly what's beginning to be developed right now. So Jersey, a couple of years ago, how many years ago? 3. I'll have to double check on that. Passed a data trust law.
Don't let facts bother you. There's not a podcast that troubles itself with it.
They passed a data trust law, so enabling this kind of collective fiduciary structure for data. The Isle of Man next year will be releasing its data asset foundation law, which I think is a really exciting opportunity. Used correctly, particularly if there's some interest in supporting it in the UK, sharing resources. There's a whole gamut of things that can be done. It actually could be really quite strategically important to the British tech industry.
I think it's interesting you say about it's not talked about or it's not considered or it's not encouraged, because I have to say slightly the impression that I got from reading this is it has been successful because it has been able to slide under the radar and because that by its very nature, by having a fragmented and non-centralized approach, you've been able to do this level of experimentation and move faster. My first question really is: are you potentially, is it wise that you're here and telling people about it? And because is the obvious thing not for a British government on the take to say, oh gosh, there's a huge amount of money here. We could, in a nationalist way, this is a Labour government, but it's one that's very concerned with Britain. We could bring some of that money here. Maybe, if you go through it, you have to give money, have to pay some amount to Britain. What is the way that this could benefit Britain in a way that doesn't undermine the benefits and the strengths of this system?
Yes. There's a few interesting bits in that. I think, firstly, on the notion that, the British government could just grab all the money, which, sad to say, is something one has occasionally come across. There was a particular MP who will remain nameless, if only because I've forgotten his name, who actually proposed this. I got sent it some sort of TikTok reel of him saying, look at these islands, let's grab the money and pay the NHS. It's just a profound misunderstanding of what's going on, and also the impact that would have. There's not some gigantic vaults where you could just literally lift it up and nick it. In fact,
which I think is the view that many people do have, right?
I think the MP must have been Richard Bergen.
Yeah,
so he's giving me that impression.
Couldn't possibly comment. In fact, a lot of the time the money's all digital anyway, right? But it's sitting in London anyway. It's already here. It's just being controlled in a slightly different way. The other thing is that there are a hell of a lot of different offshore financial centres out there. Loads and loads and loads of places that have created offshore financial laws, low tax laws, special economic zones, and are trying to get business in. But there's a reason why the British ones are the most successful. And that's because the international investors, they trust Britain, they trust the common law system, and they trust ultimately the neutrality and independence of the law that is practiced there. And they know that if something goes wrong in those jurisdictions, ultimately they can rely on London, to help out. That gives people confidence. If something like what you just mentioned, i.e. that CDOTs was to happen, the whole thing would break down. And importantly, someone who's skeptical of these jurisdictions might say, "Oh, boo-hoo." Importantly, that would make Britain poorer.
But that gets me just to the second part of that question. Like, the benefit largely seems to be it acts as a place that a lot of our financial services, our lawyers, our sort of bright young things who could be going and founding interesting and enthusiastic and novel startups in energy or manufacturing, instead are working until 1 o'clock in the morning, like rewriting contracts to be maximally tax efficient. Like that is a group that I can see, and maybe our listeners, who I hope will, many of whom I think are in this class of person, like they're benefiting. How is Britain benefiting more broadly, or is that enough of a benefit? Like, is it good just that the city and the people around it have this work? Because how is Britain benefiting from this directly, I think?
So I think there's a couple of different angles there. I think the first thing is that if there's someone, so take the example of, for instance, someone who is a fund manager for a Guernsey fund. Now, the capital has come in from all over the world, and it's sitting there in Guernsey, in this tax-neutral place, and there is a fund manager sitting in London managing that, taking his, 1.5, sometimes 2% investment management fee. When he does well, he then gets taxed here in the UK at a UK tax rate, and that is money going back in, to the to HMRC, and therefore funding everything else. So there's already, a positive on that, and I think that's a really important one. And again, it's global, right? This network means that the British professional services sector can play in this global space. So to take another example, the British Virgin Islands, I think it's something like about 66%, if I recall my own report correctly, 66% of all of the assets intermediated through the British Virgin Islands concern stuff in Greater China, primarily the mainland, but also, Hong Kong might be part of the chain, and Taiwan too. Often the transactions are between two mainland people using a Cayman BVI entity. So what you have there is a lawyer or an accountant or whatever else sitting in London or somewhere else in the UK who's able to bring home tax revenue for the UK and for the greater benefit of the British population from something that would otherwise have absolutely no nexus to the UK at all. Something taking place in Shenzhen or Sichuan. And I think that's great. You do have another point, though, which is what you might refer to overall as the finance curse. This whole thing of Britain's best and brightest spending the best years of their lives, trying to get a little bit more financial performance for corporation, or, I don't know, writing a slightly better trading widget. And I think of all the criticisms that I've seen mounted against the offshores, most of them I reject quite strongly in the report. But this one to me is the most interesting. I think we have to be realistic. We have to accept that finance is the golden goose of the British economy, but that it is a very demanding golden goose, a big, bullying, squawking golden goose, perhaps, as some industries might think it. We have to protect it, cosset it, keep on getting it to lay the eggs, but also encourage, and really strain the metaphor there, also encourage other birds to come. And this is where I think the CDOT future concept that I've been developing recently, in the period after this report, talking about how these jurisdictions can be used to boost not just British finance, but the British tech industry, is quite important. We should see them not just as places to bring more capital in and out of the UK, but also as zones of experimentation for other sectors and other industries.
Well, like, which ones? I suppose like a key question here is, how can the CDOTs make us richer?
Well, so I mentioned one earlier, right? So for instance, in data, if we were to use the CDOTs or to promote, and I should also say this is it has to be an equal relationship. It's sort of partnership rather than exploitation. Each of these jurisdictions, if you just try to exploit them, it just simply won't work. Britain should partner with these jurisdictions to create new industries, because ultimately these places are quite small. They simply won't have the professional depth So they can do a fairly good job, but if it becomes global, they necessarily have to rely on expertise elsewhere. So, for instance, that data intermediary one, if there are these new data vehicles in the different jurisdictions, that will boost the British technology sector. Think of all the data stewards, the data auditors, the developers who then have more data sets to play with. There's all sorts of different things. Or, consider AI agent laws. I don't know. There's a whole host of different things you could begin to play with.
It's an interesting, and you say about that curse of finance, and maybe we replace finance with tech, and I think that that's probably a better trade. But I think it's sort of interesting tension where you've got the City of London originally rose because it was working with British assets, and it was British capital that was being deployed. And a lot of that was then run down in the Second World War, and it was bought by the government, and then given. People in Britain were given sterling in exchange for foreign, so that these could be sold for foreign currency. It does put us in this interesting position of the butler to the world, and people have called London the London laundromat. And I know you say that that money laundering is less of a problem. What do you think of and this is not, I don't want this to be read as a criticism, but how do we balance and manage that idea of that there are a few people who act as emissaries or can provide these services, and it is so focused in one place, how? And I think on Tom's point of how can the riches, or how can Britain benefit, is there a way that this can be less of a providing of services, which is a very very small amount of people are able to benefit from? And yes, you say tax revenues, but it's not a building of capital, is it? It's not a building of assets that are generating capital. It's labour.
So I'd have to disagree. So yes, there is a labour point on it, and I think it's a strong and good point, which is why I've emphasised it. But ultimately, to stay in that labour point briefly, if there is Labour doing well out of the CDOT connection, and they are saving and then they're investing, that does increase British capital formation. Secondly, though, these jurisdictions are used to invest in British businesses. If the British businesses are doing well, they are then investing in things. When the founders exit, or whoever the owners exit, they can then reinvest it. They can do new things. I actually think it helps with the process of British capital formation. Now, insofar as the problem is, there's sort of a question like this. It's a fascinating one, but it can swiftly spiral, because a lot of this then gets back into the interests and views of British savers. Where are they investing their money? Are they investing it all overseas? But we start getting into a whole host of other questions there. But I think on your basic point, I would say that it aids British capital formation.
Is there anything they can do in the way of working with atoms rather than bits? Working with atoms seems to be where the true value of the 21st century will be created.
When you say working with atoms, what do you mean? As in, you mean
doing things in the real world rather than on spreadsheets, slide decks.
There are, once you take the frame that actually, if you take a step back, what I'm saying in the report, and then in the efforts with CDOT Future, this pro CDOT policy group that I've been working on, it's not necessarily to be prescriptive. In fact, it isn't at all to be prescriptive, because the islands are too diverse, the technologies, the businesses, the industries, all of these things are too diverse. But it's to say, actually, these represent a space of dynamism and creativity, which we can use to bolster Britain and British businesses. I would actually say that there's a whole host of opportunities, not all of which have been thought of yet. Some cases, for instance, like, say, the Isle of Man, I think there's quite an interesting opportunity for it to be used to test the special data zones concept that the Labour government was coming out with earlier this year. So, for instance, having more data centres there, which, hey, there's some atoms there. You could, for instance, then just think bigger, which I think probably starts taking us onto some of your favourite topics, which is, some of these jurisdictions have vast amounts of space, and you could do all sorts of things in them. What could we do in the Falkland Islands in terms of building factories there or building new kinds of facility? What could happen in the British Antarctic territories? There's all sorts of things. And there's others too. I think one of the things that has been not explored enough is the potential role of these jurisdictions in the British space sector. It's sort of slightly ludicrous, I think, to some people when you mention it, but for some years the Isle of Man was one of the world's leading space jurisdictions. Now, again, this was slightly financialized, yes. The reason why that was the case and why people registered there, it all had to do with a particular incentive for, I think it was mid-orbital satellite fleets, if I recall it correctly. But what that did in turn mean is it developed actually, some physical businesses there, like some optics firms. Again, we could do that. You could almost even, have partnerships with the regulatory regimes in each jurisdiction of specific industries and then use that to promote investment and actually promote, factories being built. There's all sorts. Creativity, that's what I'm arguing for, ultimately.
Far be it for me to pass up an opportunity to talk about space or Antarctica, but you're making me think of Prospero in Honduras, which is this charter city for listeners' benefits. And one of their kind of bull cases for why it might be a great idea is that they can be much more flexible about their regulatory regimes pertaining to kind of medicine and biotech than is typical. Indeed, if you have a startup there, you can choose which regulatory regime from abroad to abide by. And that seems to me to be a great environment to develop new drugs or new biotech, such that if there are enough places like this, they will leapfrog everyone else working on medicine and biotech.
Well, there's that company whose name I think what are they called? I think they're called Microloop, which that they promise if you fly down, they will inject you with plasmids that will. And I am technically a biologist, so I should really know this, but a gene that will block a pathway, and you will then develop muscle without effort.
Right, so this is to muscle growth as Istanbul is to hair.
Exactly. Yes,
All these small men coming back on the plane.
Exactly. All the planes. Well, it's like people coming. Flights from the US coming from up from Brazil, and all the women are kneeling on their seats.
Oh, because of their butt lifts.
Oh,
really?
Yeah, exactly. They're BBLs. So in a similar way, you have the men sort of filling out their seats.
Yeah, I got my Falklands biceps this weekend.
At this point, James, we finished talking. You can return us to a sensible conversation.
I was just
bring us back to earth.
So look, I think Prospero is a very interesting example of regulatory experimentation. My understanding is it's been not without certain challenges, perhaps, but I think the cause of experimentation is a good one, and that's on a very broad and abstract level precisely what I'm arguing for here. Again, let's take the Falkland Islands. Why couldn't we set up on a particular part of it multiple different regulatory regimes for them to experiment with, and invite entrepreneurs and have businesses there? I'm sure there's all sorts of logistical difficulties occasioned by that particular suggestion, but why not? What's to be lost?
No, but the more of this stuff we do, the more secure our claim in future.
Yes, exactly, Tom. We need you to set up a fashion brand that goes out of the Antarctic territory. Because did you see there was the American who flew into the Chilean section of Antarctica? Or was it the South Sandwich Islands?
Calum, it is not the Chilean section of Antarctica.
The Chilean claims
Antarctica. The South Sandwich Islands, where there are 17 research centres, one of them Chilean, and this American who's trying to fly to every continent touched down near the Chilean base. They apprehended him.
Well, and this is
the British territory,
and this is why, Tom. This is why, Tom.
Which is claimed by the Chileans.
We need to embrace the similar attitude of the of the East India Company, or of sort of. If you set up enough companies, Tom, registered on the South Sandwich Islands, our claim will be a lot stronger. So, Tom, you need to get into Antarctic parkas or something like that.
Well, I think there is a serious point here which touches more on the more vulnerable territories that we don't use as much as say BVI. And if we're not using them, we will lose them in a more dangerous multipolar world.
Yeah,
Antarctica is
exactly.
like a kind of-
although surely
there's a big
surely
risk.
the like presence of like I mean what are fundamentally like legal fictions is
Well,
not.
I think
no,
I feel at this point in time
I
I
recognize.
must rebut this quite
No,
strongly
I
in
recognise-
the
and I
interest
recognise
of all
Can't
of
say
the...
it doesn't exist.
I recognise that. Yeah, exactly. I still don't have object permanence if I put my hands in front of my eyes. It just is. But okay, well that is obviously a provocative way of putting it. But does like the if the Falkland Islands did this, surely you wouldn't see a wave of, I don't know, Brazilian entrepreneurs like decamping to Port Stanley.
Why not? It's a question of incentives, marketing, and general enthusiasm. I mean,
But is there not a problem about? I suppose the internet means the market, like where you are. Yeah.
so there would be some probably, I imagine, some quite strong cost constraints because of them bringing the energy over. Then why not use
Well, I mean,
locally abundant energy sources in the Falkland
all
Islands?
the oil rigs. No, I know. I mean,
Exactly.
well, and that's an interesting case, right? Where didn't the British government block the Falklands from
Yes, I
developing
believe-
these?
yeah.
Someone else,
Yes.
like Crag Hoppers, is doing it.
Yeah, they're like to prevent them from developing these oil fields. Like, again, James, should you not be like keeping stum? And like the worst possible thing that could happen to you is like Ed Miliband hears about
But this
this.
is how I feel about Antarctica sometimes. Like, if Labour find out, they will try to give it away for no reason.
Yes, I think. Look,
You see James immediately like, oh, well, I've got to go.
so I think, to be clear, what I'm not arguing for is central control of these jurisdictions. I think that could generate some of the problems that we've identified over the last few minutes of talking. What I am arguing for is a greater consciousness of their potential benefits, and sharing resources, giving people a little bit of support, maybe having some interesting secondments, etc. I mean, there's all kinds of different things, but no, I think the benefit of these jurisdictions is their independent or their semi-independent character. So threatening that or destroying that would kind of just make the whole thing fall apart. Having said that, though, some places there's basically no one there. British Antarctica, no permanent residents. South Georgia, these I think. These are perhaps to be thought about maybe in a slightly different way to places where there are pre-existing industries and pre-existing populations. In many cases, have been there for hundreds of years. And I think, again, that argument, that urge I'm making towards creativity, what can we do? Yeah.
And could some of those like new rules then be implemented in Britain? I mean, surely that has to. Or am I being too parochial about
why don't we be imaginative and possibly even consider creating new crown dependencies? I mean, look at, say, the Shetland Islands or the Orkney Islands. We could make those crown dependencies. And then, in particular, because there's space assets there, the spaceports, it could be an actual centre. You mentioned the desire to have atoms, not just bits. I was about to say the sky's the limit, but that was almost too cliched for that particular. I didn't think it is anyway. Yeah, there's all sorts. And on that bit of taking things home, I mean, yeah. Again, it's a slightly financial example, but in Gibraltar, you can passport your financial services license into Britain. Now, if you take the idea that you can set up something in one place and then passport it back, well, again, if we have this this view of creativity, what could you do with that? Could you do that with more different industry licenses in the different jurisdictions? Could you then say, well, perhaps you can come here, get licensed for cheaper than other places. You can have this incentive, but if ever you go public, you have to list it on the London Stock Exchange or have a very large tax haircut. There's all kinds of things we could do to reshore and bring things home after they've been practiced, trialed elsewhere.
Now, listeners of this podcast will, of course, be aware of our horror of the Chagos Islands deal, and they might well ask, what about the Falklands? What about places like that? Can we actually defend these overseas territories? I
think it's a question of money and it's a question of will. Obviously, in the Falklands, there's pre-existing military resources, which goes a long way. I suppose, of course, crucially, there was pre-existing military resources in the Chagos Islands too. I think it just comes down to appetite.
Well, Philip Calum, who was on the show a few weeks ago, thinks it was a good idea to give away the Chagos Islands because we wouldn't be able to defend them if we wanted to.
That's not quite true. He said that it was like fraud or like a fiction for us to claim that they were meaningfully ours. Surely, like if you can't defend them, you can't meaningfully call them yours. Is that not? Surely.
Well, yeah, I think we're trying to approximate his view, maybe not
Sure,
getting it quite
yeah.
right, but the fundamental point is if we can't defend them, maybe we shouldn't be investing in them.
Well, I think, if we were to consider, say, the British Antarctic Territory as one, which I know is a favourite of yours, at the end of the day, that's a gigantic supply line to defend. So if ever there was to be a situation of, more international engagement with the Antarctic, people setting up businesses there, using natural resources, that would be something we'd have to consider. Ultimately, I suppose one of the things that drives my interest with CDOT Future and considering, how to be creative with these jurisdictions, how they can help the British economy, British technology, British interests, it is that sense of we're moving into a world of larger states focusing more obviously on the national interest, and I think we need to do the same. And the questioning what is in our interest will vary between each place and jurisdiction, but I'd say broadly giving things up willy-nilly isn't a good idea.
I think, listeners, we will return to the topic of Mongolian adventurism after the break. But first, a brief word from our sponsors.
My name is Matt V. I'm the director of the Society for Technological Advancement, also known as SOTA. I would like you, Anglo-Futurism listeners, to write to us. SOTA Letters is an online journal for any innovators, technologists, or scientists who have new ideas, derided theories, or any side projects they're going after. Please write about anything that you're doing. Please go to info@ilikethefuture.com or read previous submissions at sotaletters.substack.com. Looking forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you.
Welcome back, listeners. We're here in the King Charles III Space Station with James Kingston, and I'm looking through the Mullion's porthole, and I do believe we're passing over the Cayman Islands. What should be exciting us about the Cayman Islands?
Well, the Cayman Islands, other than its glittering seas, its fine scuba diving opportunities, the many, highly innovative financial services professionals there. I think one of the things we haven't really spoken to is just enough, perhaps, in this talk, is just the sheer scale of the capital going through them. So the Cayman Islands, right, it's absolutely tiny. We're talking about a few tens of thousands of people there, but 70% of the world's hedge funds are domiciled there. And what that means, actually, is that it has some $2.7 trillion sitting in Cayman funds, Cayman fund entities, which is actually more than those sitting in the United States, which at the time, when I was doing that paper, was 2.11 trillion. So this tiny
Are
little...
you thinking what I'm thinking?
Well, I mean, I think the tragedy would be that our bank robbing or hedge fund robbing gig to the Cayman Islands would actually end up with us, I don't know, drunk out of our minds on a beach and nary a server purloined.
It's a win-win.
Yes. So yeah, no, it's crazy, really, just the sheer scale.
But the Crown couldn't seize it.
Well, could Charles raise feudal levies from these territories, given that they are his property?
Well, I mean, yes, in Jersey, Guernsey, their connections to the Duchy of Normandy. I think, actually, of course, Parliament is sovereign. It could make laws wherever the hell it wants to. It could make laws on the moon. It could make them on Alpha Centauri. It just mightn't always necessarily be a very good use of legislative time. I think, though, the thing is with the Crown Dependencies and overseas territories, the claim is an interesting one, right? Because these are semi-independent jurisdictions, but certainly the UK does have a few more levers there. I think it's just a bad idea to use most of the levers, but perhaps smaller ones, collaborative ones, are the ones I'm talking about here.
We talked before the break, and we sort of started getting onto this topic of the emergence of a multipolar order and world order and the rise of Chinese money. And I think there is a fear, again, this is me in my most anti-financial sort of financial world attitude, saying this, there's a fear that Qatari money, Russian money has created a dependency in the city that is similar to the German need for Russian gas, that when the war broke out, the German economic miracle all collapses because there's the gas isn't coming anymore. is this like a meaningful or a valid fear? Like, are we at the mercy of the sheikhs?
Are we at the mercy of the sheikhs? It's interesting, isn't it? On one hand, British economic and political strategy for the last several decades has been predicated on being completely open to the world. And then on the other hand, we sometimes get a little bit worried by some of the things that could mean. I think in all events, what we need going forward is to really focus on our national interest. And, maybe that does mean collaborating in dynamic ways with as many different places as we can and balancing them against each other. One of the things that often strikes me, though, in this general debate around, these torrents of foreign capital from regimes we don't like that probably have hotter weather on the whole, and that, the Daily Mail et al. Can raise eyebrows, or maybe more than eyebrows, is that we're kind of ignoring the obvious point if we're talking about international influence, which is the profound, pervasive influence of the United States. Really, a lot of this story is about US capital, US investment. We spend our lives, I'm sure people log on to any, you go onto your Gmail, you go into Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, whatever else it might be every day, and you're using an American platform.
As Tom and I, of course, communicate solely in preparation for this podcast with Snapchat and selfies.
Well, no comment.
As is visible from the quality of the preparation.
Yes, but yeah, no, I think that's the true story, and one we're forgetting there. The paper, the jumping off point of that paper that really led me getting so gloriously deep into the weeds of all of these questions was whether or not these jurisdictions are a shadow empire of British finance. One of the top conclusions was, yes, look, obviously these jurisdictions have very strong ties to the UK. This brings net benefits to the UK of one or two nuances like that finance coasting we discussed earlier. But ultimately, the UK is, the CDOTs are a constituent node of a wider story of US financial and general economic imperium. There's this quote I found from the 1920s in Argentina. There was a British ambassador writing back to London, basically saying that for all intents and purposes, the Argentines were part of the British Empire, even though they were formally independent. And he sort of reeled off all the different trade figures and all the meat that went up into Smithfield and the way that all the British banks were giving the capital to build the railways, etc., etc. So they're part of the British Empire, but really would be impolite to say so. And I think there's an element of that today. I think if we were to start throwing around the empire word, then the greater and I think more urgent story for Britain's economy, society, and future is, and if we consider how independent we want to be, it's quite how much, where do we want to be in relation to the United States?
I've heard it argued by someone quite senior in the British progress scene. I'm not sure how tongue-in-cheek he was being, but we should just hurry up and become part of the United States, especially if they're about to dominate AI and leave everyone behind. Perhaps this is a bit of a loaded question on the Anglo-Futurism podcast, but where do you stand on that, James?
Said in a notably little undercurrent of force. I couldn't help but notice. I wouldn't say that Anschluss is a particular policy goal of mine. I think Britain's interests and Britain's economy and the welfare of British people are served by British independence. And key to that is making sure that we actually have industries here, that we have capabilities here, that we have resources here. And that's one of the things that's really driving CDOT Future and the things that I'm working on at the moment. Because if we're in this world that's dominated more by national self-interested powers, we need to use all the tools at our disposal. And I think for Britain, the CDOT network is one of them. And look, as for the wider point of the US, they are our allies. I think it's wonderful that we have these deep cultural ties. There are a lot of benefits that come from the association. But I think it's time to work out how we can, support ourselves a bit more, and whilst maintaining the alliance, to make sure that we have our own options.
Maybe actually we need to be taking more Chinese money, right? Like, I suppose I was struck, as you were saying, by what you said about, we're open to the world and our policy has been openness, and Britain, was very always proud to be a free trading nation, and it made us astonishingly wealthy in comparison to, say, France or Germany, who were sort of European peers, competitors who protected their markets. Like, I suppose, is it just inevitable that if you as the sort of secondary power are going to be open and it's not your capital, this process of like vassalization is just an inevitable one? Is that the nature of free trade, that it's a sort of winner takes all preferential attachment where there is always going to be a power law of where money goes, and the easier it is for British money to flow into the New York Stock Exchange, for example, or the NASDAQ, like some people have said, we need to think of ourselves more as a developing economy and try to like protect some of these industries that will allow them to develop a kind of comparative advantage.
Yes, I mean, well, there's a few themes in that. I think possibly there is the case for certain strategic sectors to maybe defend and promote them a little bit more with a view towards national interest. I think, though, on the wider point of vassalization, I think it's best to have choice and it's best to have options. If you put all your eggs in one basket, if you render yourself completely dependent, then you lose your leverage. If we take the British technology stack, for instance, if we rely entirely upon US-based companies, and there is some kind of policy change or policy disagreement in the US, then it might be very easy for certain agencies in the US to use that software power over the state and British economy to exert influence. Whereas if we had a wider supply base, and this could be at the level of the choices made by individual companies, it could also be at a higher level for the nation as a whole, then we're not so reliant. I think the vulnerability comes from the over-reliance. So I think, logically speaking, that does mean that we should seek to widen our relationships, and maybe that does include China. We should not. One of the things that really irks me, speaking on a more personal level, is this overconflation of U.S. interests with that of Britain. We have heavily aligned interests on lots of topics, but they are not the same interests. And there's always been the case, but I think something seemed to be lost. We've almost forgotten that in recent years, and I think it should be remembered. As for the China thing, look, I mean, Britain was perfectly happy to recognize the People's Republic years before the United States did, but for the fact that, the Chinese didn't want the investment because they were crazy communists at the time, sending trade delegations over, trying to get involved. We should, I think, be unafraid to explore that. But as I think anyone who writes about Britain's China policy in particular will see, we exhibit this constant yo-yo of wanting to be open and wanting to be closed, and not really working out what our interests truly are. And yes, muddle and fudge, I think, probably tends to typify that.
I think on that vein of people, us copying America, it does strike us that if the British tech scene would like to more respect and more effort, then maybe it should be a bit more successful, right? That actually the lawyers and the accountants have been the very successful ones, and thus actually, again, our comparative advantage, it lies in pinstripe and not in t-shirts. So
we're saying it should lie in the top hats of the captains of industry.
Yes, I think comparative advantage. I mean, I think one can be almost over economical in that. There's an element of having comparative advantage in one thing, but maybe one should have like a forced march into other areas. I think it's comparative advantage for all sorts of places to be good at tourism, but is it really going to help them out? Sometimes you just have to pick something and go for it. More broadly on the tech side, I think, as ever, one of the familiar little sadder cultural quirks in Britain, we do talk ourselves down. We have a bit of a problem with, reasonably sized problem with, for instance, tech valuations here, a bit of a cultural problem around people maybe exiting a bit too early, either because they want to or because the valuations. People are writing about this all the time. Academics and in great grand screeds on LinkedIn, which I see every other day or so. But at the end of the day, the UK is Europe's largest centre for technology. It has the most technology investment. It has all kinds of interesting startups. Like, there are good things happening here, and I think we should encourage them. Simply abandoning to the comparative advantage of the pinstripe, as you put it. I quite like that phrase. The pinstripe is good, but we need more.
Is there anything else you think listeners should know about the CDOTs, or any argument you'd like them to imbibe?
I think overall on the CDOTs, these places are, if I really just had to underline, we've talked about how they help the British services sector with our service exports, and that helps with tax. What they're also doing is supporting a hell of a lot of jobs. Jersey is supporting about 1 million jobs a year in the UK from capital that it intermediates. There's about 1.4 trillion pounds worth of capital intermediated through Jersey, which then comes back into the UK and supports jobs and investments. This is a great thing for the UK. The BVI does this too. I read a statistic saying that it supports about 134,000 jobs in the UK, again through the investment that it intermediates. These are very positive stories. Another one, a little bit more technocratic than, jobs, but I think it's worth mentioning, is these places are capital pumps for the British banking sector. Anything that if something gets deposited in a trust in Jersey or Guernsey, it will usually go into a British bank that has an arm in Jersey or Guernsey, and that capital then gets sucked up, gets pumped into the British banking system. So there's a statistic, I wrote it down earlier. Yes, there it is, right in front of me, thank God. So 29% of the capital deposits in Jersey banks are made from the UK. But actually, 68% of once those deposits are all made, 68% of them are going back into the UK. So that's a hell of a lot of foreign capital then coming here and boosting us.
Could I ask why again, we like tech, we would like more of tech, we think tech is like something that is valuable in its own right and we need more of. Why do people say they struggle to raise capital here then, if there is this like large source of investment or like amount of capital that is generated and coming back into British banks?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there's a number of answers to that. Partially from what I understand, people are just saying that the listing rules in the London Stock Exchange are perhaps less attractive than other places. They are getting lower multiples. There is, less deep capital reserves, and investors are generally more cautious. You're always seeing people saying that than they are in the US. I think we have to remember relative scale. We've talked about the global nature of the CDOTs and also the global nature of the capital flows into the UK. But at the end of the day, the US is a continent-sized country. We're always making it's interesting. The comparison we're always making with Britain is to the US because they're right there. We're reading about it all the time. We all speak English, but we're smaller. So sometimes I think we overly do ourselves down as a result of that. But we should be striving for the top. And again, ultimately, this is why I think these jurisdictions could be useful, because we need to increase our capital pools. But yeah, it's a multifaceted question, to be honest with you.
So you say we should be striving for the top. We're going to pose you our traditional end of podcast episode question, which is 50 years from now, what's the vision?
I think in this country we've accepted for too long culturally that we're just going to decline and that's going to be fine. There was this whole thing a few years ago, particularly around the Brexit debates, of people saying, I just want to be a normal European country. But what is normal? Why is normality something to embrace? I think, if I look ahead to a 50-year future that I like to see, it's, presuming that we've not be turned into some sort of, mass of slime by some sort of nanobot, and that the singularity has, not eradicated us all. Let's presuming that human history continues on, tracks roughly similar to what we know. What I'd like to see is a Britain that remains in the top tier of countries, that is leading in certain key industries, that has multi-trillion-dollar value businesses built here, and that is doing so with the aid and support of this network of Crown dependencies and overseas territories as centres of experimentation. I'd like to see British spaceships, British spaceports sailing out into the solar system and beyond. Why are we not using, or why don't we end up using these jurisdictions? For instance, maybe
Ascension.
Guernsey. Yes, Ascension. I mean, what a wonderful name for it. Why don't we have Jersey domiciled mining outfits going into the Oort cloud, with different... there could be all sorts of things here. Maybe the Turks and Caicos Islands.
Yes, the interstellar like cargo ships are actually flagged with the Isle of Man.
Exactly. We really can be very imaginative here, and I think
Gold top spaceships.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we should have a sense of positivity, creativity, and excitement about the future, because Britain can still do very exciting things, and I think the Crown dependencies and overseas territories can help with that.
And on that wonderful note, James, where can people follow your campaign or support your work?
Absolutely. So C.Future is the policy group that I've developed as a result of the Adam Smith paper. It promotes the use of these jurisdictions as partners to the British tech industry. You can find us at c.future.org. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Or indeed follow us on c.future at LinkedIn.
Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Tom and I will unfortunately not be remaining as part of the Anglo-Futurism podcast. We've got big news. We're actually rebranding as the Turks and Caicos Futurism podcast. We, with the
Substack charges slightly less.
Exactly.
So
It turns out I've run the numbers, and 0% tax rate on 0% income is actually better than what we're getting here in Britain. So we will be making the transition. We hope you will remain loyal listeners as we, expound the benefits of tech investment in this really, really cutting-edge jurisdiction.
And James, we will drop you off on Ascension.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.